A tech billionaire, a man who built his empire on cold calculation and speed, suddenly eschews his luxury limousine to take the single dilapidated bus route back to his childhood home. Julian Vance conquered Wall Street, but he is now collapsing under the weight of the profound loneliness that very glory created. On that journey of penance, fate ironically places him next to the sharp consultant who once used his native tongue to dismantle his arrogance. When the consultant begins sharing her small-town Christmas memories, Julian suddenly realizes the impossible truth: the woman he once insulted is the only person who holds the memory of the childhood he had rejected. Can this fateful bus ride help Julian Vance find the little Julian he lost? Or will he be forever trapped between cold glory and belated regret? Support us by subscribing to follow this touching story until the end. The air inside the Golden Quill was thick with the faint expensive perfumes of its patrons and the complex aroma of fine cuisine. For Clara Vesper, the opulent Boston restaurant was the demanding stage upon which she performed her second life. A recent graduate of comparative linguistics, she was currently buried under the weight of her student loans, a practical reality that demanded long hours in her crisp black uniform. She moved through the dining room in the year 2025 with a practiced anonymous efficiency, her intellectual prowess concealed beneath a polite, focused demeanor. The daily chaos of wealth and power she observed here was in its own way a rigorous field study in human dynamics. The atmosphere tightened when Julian Vance arrived. The CEO of Ether Dynamics was a figure of cold, almost intimidating perfection, a man whose reputation for intellectual ruthlessness was well earned. At 38, he commanded a global tech empire built on precision and zero tolerance for error. He entered the Quill flanked by two nervous executives, his custom charcoal suit and polished steel hair giving him the appearance of a master artisan's finest, most severe sculpture. To Julian Vance, anyone performing a service role was merely an anonymous component in the backdrop of his demanding world. Clara was assigned to his table. She approached with the exact standard protocol menus presented with a slight incline, water poured without a drop, spilled her expression, neutral yet attentive. Julian acknowledged her existence with a brief dismissive glance that categorized her instantly efficient, necessary, and entirely devoid of interest beyond her function. The meal became an exercise in calculated difficulty. Julian questioned the vintage of the Bordeaux not for enjoyment, but for technical specifications. He conducted his business in loud, dismissive declarations that forced the executives flanking him into strained, sycophantic agreement. Clara handled each demanding request with the calm assurance of a scholar defending a complex thesis. She knew the regional geology that influenced the wine and the complex molecular structure of the dishes. Yet she knew that in Julian Vance's perception, these were mere programmed facts, not the result of a keen, educated mind. The critical incident occurred midway through the main course. Clara was leaning in slightly to refill Julian's water glass, balancing the heavy silver pitcher carefully, when his primary executive, attempting an overly enthusiastic agreement with the point Julian had just made, gesticulated wildly. His elbow struck the edge of the heavy oak table. The resultant jolt was sudden and sharp. A single dark drop of red wine, a vintage Julian had grudgingly approved, escaped the glass and landed squarely on the pristine lapel of his tailored suit jacket. The movement in the restaurant seemed to halt. The executive froze, horrified. Julian did not move, either his hand pausing inches from his plate. He did not look at Clara. He fixed his gaze solely on the small dark stain, as if it were a declaration of war. "I am so terribly sorry, Mr. Vance." Clara began immediately, her voice low and apologetic, her training kicking in instantly. Julian held up a hand, stopping her apology before it was fully formed. His silence was more damning than any shout. Then he turned to his executive team, his face set in a look of icy, contemptuous disgust. He switched languages instantly, using the formal cutting precision of German, certain that his cruel assessment would remain cloaked from the help. In German, Julian began a low, venomous monologue directed at his subordinates. He was not merely angry about the wine. He was venting his intellectual arrogance. "Look at this," he stated, his voice ringing with disdain. "They hire these pretty Hohler-Kopf children and call it service. She probably has the intelligence of a Gärtlichen Zwerg, an empty-headed child. She is only good for standing there looking decorative, utterly incompetent." The two executives forced nervous, strained chuckles, eager to agree with their powerful boss. They offered sympathetic, pitying glances toward Clara, secure in the bond of their shared secret language. Clara stood motionless, the water pitcher heavy in her hand. The cold, precise German words did not land on deaf ears. They landed in the mind of a highly trained linguist who not only understood every syllable and grammatical structure, but also the brutal, condescending intent behind them. It was not a complaint about service. It was a profoundly personal attack on the core of her identity as an intelligent human being. Empty-headed child. Incompetent. The words dismissed not her hands, but the mind that housed her years of academic study and her knowledge of semantics. The carefully maintained professional shield she wore dissolved, replaced by the glacial calm of the scholar. A quiet, determined fury settled within her. She had been tested, judged, and dismissed. Now she knew exactly the nature of the man she was dealing with, and exactly how deep the fight would have to be. The silence that followed Julian Vance's calculated insult was immediate and profound. It was the moment a predator pauses before the final strike, secure in the knowledge that his prey is paralyzed. For Julian, this silence was confirmation of his superiority. For Clara Vesper, it was the necessary pause before the counterattack. She did not flinch, cry, or rush. With a deliberate, slow movement, Clara placed the heavy silver water pitcher down onto the service stand beside the table. Her action was final, marking an end to her role as the invisible servant. Her spine straightened, the slight professional deference in her posture melting away to reveal the rigid composure of the intellectual. The polite, strained smile she had worn for the entire evening vanished, replaced by an expression of cool, intellectual clarity. The two executives at the table began to fidget nervously. They sensed the shift in the atmosphere, a primal disruption of the social order. Julian, still focused on the minuscule wine stain on his jacket, finally lifted his eyes, ready to deliver his concluding dismissal in English. But Clara spoke first. Her voice, usually modulated to a soft, professional murmur, cut through the restaurant's ambient hush with the precise ringing clarity of a bell. And she did not speak the language of Boston commerce. She spoke the formal academic German of a graduate seminar room. "Herr Vance," she began, her pronunciation impeccable, her tone devoid of emotion. "Your assessment of my cognitive function, though delivered with theatrical conviction, contains a significant error in case structure. The appropriate linguistic usage demanded the dative case, not the accusative, when referencing the subject of your contempt." The immediate effect on Julian Vance was seismic, his face a mask of cold arrogance only moments before drained of color. His jaw loosened slightly, and his body remained utterly still. The shock was pure, unfiltered disbelief, the kind reserved for encountering the impossible. He was staring at a phantom mirror reflecting a knowledge he assumed was exclusive to his inner circle. Clara continued weaving her academic knowledge into a devastating philosophical critique. "Moreover," she stated, maintaining her steady gaze, "your argument is founded upon a flawed premise. To cite the philosopher Schopenhauer, intelligence is not a function of one's station, but the competence with which one uses the language available to define reality. You chose a language to conceal your arrogance, yet you utilized it with grammatical inaccuracy. Your statement therefore functions less as a critique of my competence and more as a profound self-critique of your own ethical foundation." She had not only understood every hateful cutting syllable he had uttered, but she had dismantled his argument, corrected his grammar, and used his own culture's intellectual heritage to turn his scorn back upon him. It was a flawless surgical strike that exposed the raw, vulnerable ego beneath the billionaire's expensive suit. The executive manager, Harrison, finally rushed forward, his face pale with panic. He had heard the foreign language, but recognized the universal sound of a high-stakes catastrophe. "Mr. Vance, I apologize. I don't know what she said, but I will terminate her immediately. Jensen, my office now." Harrison reached out, ready to drag Clara away and salvage his restaurant's relationship with the titan of industry. "Step back, Harrison." Julian Vance's voice, now sharp and commanding in English, cut through the manager's frantic apologies. Harrison froze his hand, hanging awkwardly in the air. Julian's eyes, which had been wide with shock, now narrowed with a fierce, calculating intensity. The astonishment had given way to recognition. This was not a girl. This was a weapon perfectly honed and utterly unexpected. Julian pushed the heavy business card he had taken out earlier further across the table toward Clara. He spoke no longer with contempt, but with the cold, clear appreciation of a man who recognizes valuable scarcity. "You are dismissed, Harrison," Julian said, not looking at the manager. "Miss Vesper is now under contract with Ether Dynamics." He fixed his gaze back on Clara, who stood motionless, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "Your intellect is undeniable," Julian stated, "and your courage, demonstrated by using my own language to expose my error, is a commodity I value above any technical skill. I am offering you the position of Cultural Strategy Director, effective immediately. The salary will be commensurate with executive compensation. A life-changing figure." He paused, allowing the weight of the offer to settle. "Be at the Ether Dynamics headquarters in the Prudential Tower tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Ask for the executive suite." Julian had recognized that the very qualities he had sought to dismiss, her academic depth and her moral spine, were the exact traits he desperately needed to navigate the complex, often deceitful world of global business. Clara Vesper finally allowed a small, almost imperceptible tremor to run through her hand as she reached for the business card. The card felt impossibly heavy, promising an immediate escape from debt and a leap into a world she had only read about. She looked at the man who minutes ago had labeled her incompetent, but who now offered her the keys to his kingdom. "Understood, Mr. Vance," Clara replied, her voice firm. 8 o'clock. She turned and walked away, leaving the stunned manager and the silenced executives in her wake. The path forward was terrifying, but the debt-ridden path behind her was now definitively closed. The Ether Dynamics headquarters pierced the Boston skyline, a monument of glass and cold steel, rising above the older brick-and-mortar financial institutions. The lobby was a vast, minimalist space of polished black marble and stark white light, designed to intimidate and impress. When Clara Vesper stepped off the express elevator onto the 80th floor at precisely 8 o'clock, she felt the contrast acutely. Her sensible thrift store blazer and black trousers felt hopelessly inadequate against the backdrop of tailored excellence worn by every executive that briskly crossed her path. Julian Vance's executive assistant, a severe, efficient woman named Lena, greeted Clara with a gaze that clearly conveyed surprise but absolute professionalism. Clara was led immediately into the CEO's corner office. The office was breathtaking. 3 walls were floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a dizzying panoramic view of the entire city. The 4th wall was lined not just with financial texts, but with extensive collections of literature, history, and philosophy, much of it in German. Julian Vance sat behind a massive desk of dark polished wood, the surface entirely clean, save for a single crystal water carafe and a slim black laptop. He did not immediately look up. This was a calculated power play, forcing the interviewee to absorb the scope of his domain, to feel small before the negotiation even began. Clara did not sit down. She remained standing near the edge of the desk, meeting the CEO's gaze steadily when he finally lifted his eyes. "Miss Vesper." Julian began, his voice devoid of the earlier theatrical contempt, yet still clinical and challenging. You are punctual, a necessary quality. Let us dispense with pleasantries. The salary for the cultural strategy director is $300,000 per annum, plus a $20,000 signing bonus. Do you accept? He was testing her, expecting immediate grateful acceptance. I accept the position, Mr. Vance, Clara replied, her voice calm and firm, drawing upon the same intellectual reserve that had fueled her retort the night before. But before we proceed, I must outline my conditions. Julian's silver eyebrows arched slightly. He leaned back in his chair, a flicker of genuine intrigue replacing his habitual coldness. Conditions. You are in a position to dictate terms. I am in a position to define my value, Clara corrected softly. Value which you determined last night is non-negotiable. I have 3 conditions concerning the structure of our relationship. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. First, Clara began addressing the insult directly, yet framing it as a professional mandate. Our partnership must be based upon mutual intellectual respect. My analyses are to be considered, not merely heard. I will not tolerate being spoken to in a demeaning or dismissive manner in any language. My expertise is not a commodity for your casual contempt. It is an active resource. If my work is flawed, critique the methodology. Do not critique the mind behind it. Julian stared at her, an expression of profound assessment replacing the previous annoyance. He was impressed by her unwavering nerve. Second, she continued, moving quickly to the practical. I am still completing my master's degree at Columbia. My thesis, which requires dedicated research hours, is my academic priority. I require full flexibility in my schedule to complete my coursework and defend my thesis. My work for ether dynamics will remain excellent, but my education is non-negotiable. Julian nodded slowly, a slight tightening around his lips. He respected ambition, particularly when it superseded immediate financial gain. And finally, Clara stated, reaching the decisive term, the point designed to strike at the moral heart of their initial encounter. The signing bonus you offered, the $20,000, I want it redirected. Ether Dynamics has a robust philanthropic foundation. I want that amount used to establish a scholarship fund for students in the humanities at my university, specifically targeting those studying linguistic philosophy. She articulated the name clearly. We will call it the Julian Vance and Ether Dynamics Fellowship in Lingual Dignity. The silence returned vast and echoing in the panoramic office. Clara had not just asked for money, she had demanded a permanent public monument to the very field of study he had mocked, forcing him to pay for his arrogance with philanthropic legacy. It was a perfect, audacious move that transformed a private humiliation into a public statement of principle. Julian leaned forward, his hands steepled beneath his chin. He studied Clara for a full minute, assessing not the woman before him, but the intellectual chess move she had just executed. She had not succumbed to greed or flattery. She had used his own desire for corporate reputation and his respect for intellectual rigor to establish her ethical superiority. Finally, Julian let out a short, sharp sigh that was closer to reluctant admiration than annoyance. Miss Vesper, he said, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. You are indeed more dangerous than I estimated. He stood extending his hand across the wide desk. I accept all terms. The scholarship details will be handled by the foundation director this afternoon. Welcome to Ether Dynamics. As Clara firmly shook his hand, she knew she had not simply secured a job, she had secured a battleground. The high salary meant freedom from debt, but the conditions meant she would enter this toxic environment with her moral shield intact. Their tense, high-stakes collaboration had officially begun. The 6 months following Clara's audacious negotiation were less a period of employment and more a state of continuous high-altitude warfare. The $300,000 salary, a number that still felt abstract and unreal, instantly erased her debt and relocated her to a small professional apartment near the Prudential Tower, replacing the cramped book-lined rooms of her student life. But the cost of this ascent was perpetual vigilance. Clara Vesper proved instantly, undeniably invaluable. Her job description, cultural strategy director, was a bureaucratic understatement for the complexity of her role. She did not merely translate documents, she translated intention. She read the subtle shifts in cadence during multi-billion-dollar negotiations with German conglomerate heads, discerning the difference between a definitive yes and a polite not yet. Chat. She navigated the unspoken hierarchies and linguistic traps Julian Vance intentionally set for his partners, ensuring ether dynamics never suffered a misstep rooted in cultural ignorance. She was the essential silent anchor in Julian's world of perpetual motion. Their relationship was an intricate machine built entirely on mutual intense intellectual respect and nothing else. There were no pleasantries, no casual Friday lunches, and certainly no warmth. Julian, though, he had honored every one of Clara's non-negotiable terms: the respect, the thesis flexibility, the generous funding of the fellowship in lingual dignity, remained the demanding, formidable CEO. Their interactions were confined to analysis strategy and stark, unfiltered intellectual exchange. He called her Miss Vesper. She called him Mr. Vance. As the summer of 2025 faded into the short, cold days of late autumn, their success reached dizzying heights. Ether Dynamics closed 2 massive acquisitions, largely thanks to Clara's ability to read the unspoken subtext. Yet, with every victory came a profound internalized exhaustion. Both were trapped by the demands of their elite status, Julian, by the expectation of perpetual dominance, and Clara by the necessity of sustaining the intellectual miracle that had bought her freedom. She sat at her expansive desk, free from debt, but profoundly lonely, aware that the wealth she now inhabited was also a gilded cage. The emotional shield Julian Vance wore was almost impenetrable, but Clara, the linguist, knew that even the most perfect language has fissures. She observed the tiny signs of the toll the work was taking. The faint shadows under his eyes, the increasing reliance on cold coffee late into the evening. One blustery evening in early December of 2025, they were closeted in Julian's office, reviewing the final graphic design mock-ups for a high-profile holiday marketing campaign aimed at the European market. The room was dark, lit only by the bright glow of the monitor and the distant streetlights of Boston. Julian, focused and intense, scrolled through a series of polished, hyper-stylized images of winter markets and cheerful European families. He paused on one image, a simple, somewhat idealized wood carving of a traditional German Christmas star hanging over a humble, snow-covered cottage. For a moment, a flash of time lasting barely a breath, Julian's relentless intensity broke. His posture softened almost imperceptibly, his gaze distant. He muttered something so low that it was only audible because the office was otherwise silent. The words were German, and Clara caught them instantly. It was a simple maternal phrase, not a business strategy or a cynical observation. Lass dich nicht unterkriegen. Don't let them get you down. Julian immediately shook his head, clearing the memory like he would clear a frustrating browser window. He returned to the campaign, his face instantly reestablishing its iron control. This star's too sentimental, Miss Vesper. Have them redesign it. It lacks gravitas. But Clara had already filed the moment away. The phrase was a deeply personal idiom, a phrase of encouragement, of resilience, the kind only a mother or close family member would imprint on a child facing a struggle. It was a flash of the little Julian he had suppressed, triggered by the simple sentimental image of home and the holiday season. A week later, the work pressure reached its zenith. Julian, concluding a stressful video conference with the Asian division, believed he was alone in his private office as Clara sorted documents near the door. The only sound was the low, steady humming of the building's ventilation system. Julian rubbed his temples, a rare sign of physical fatigue. Clara heard him sigh deeply, the sound heavy and burdened, and then he muttered the words that finally confirmed her observation. Pine Creek, Christmas, it's too much. The destination, the season, the weariness, Clara understood. Pine Creek was not a holiday destination. It was a commitment, a burden, a confrontation with a past he had successfully avoided for years. Despite the millions of dollars and the panoramic views, Julian Vance was just as internally exhausted and desperately lonely as she was. He was preparing not for a vacation, but for a dreaded, necessary homecoming. The first hints of Christmas in Boston in the year 2025 were a cold, polished spectacle. Store windows along Newbury Street glittered with costly perfection, and the air was filled with the strained, high-pitched excitement of luxury consumption. For Clara Vesper, the high-altitude life at Ether Dynamics, though financially liberating, had become stiflingly artificial. She was professionally successful, her days packed with critical decision-making, but her soul longed for the genuine, simple rhythm of her past. She had received a flurry of invitations to holiday galas and executive dinners events glittering with the very elite whose subtexts she was paid to dissect. One by one, Clara declined them all. The thought of spending Christmas Eve exchanging strained pleasantries with people who equated competence with corporate title filled her with a profound, almost physical dread. She craved something real, something quiet, something that resonated with the forgotten simple joy of her childhood. Her gaze drifted to the crumpled, faded postcard tucked into her desk drawer, a snowy scene of a small wooden bridge spanning a frozen creek. The inscription was simple. "See you soon, my dear." Mrs. V. Clara submitted her vacation request, choosing not the warm, anonymous beaches favored by her colleagues, but the exact opposite, a return to Pine Creek, Maine, the small snowbound town of her formative years. Meanwhile, 3 floors above, Julian Vance was fighting a battle of his own. He stood by the window of his enormous office, the metropolitan lights reflecting in his impassive eyes. His mother had called him the previous evening not to demand his presence, but to inquire about his well-being in a voice so gentle it felt like an accusation after his 15 years of neglect. The memory of the little German proverb, "Lass dich nicht unterkriegen," don't let them get you down, resonated with a weight that surpassed any corporate debt. Julian recognized the deep internal shift. His success had become a vast, beautiful prison, and the price of his dominance was the systematic erosion of his humanity. He needed to step away from the Julian Vance of Ether Dynamics, the demanding, merciless CEO, and see if the little Julian, his parents still remembered, was salvageable. His decision to return to Pine Creek for the first time in 15 years was not an act of holiday cheer. It was an act of penance. He issued strict instructions to Lena, his executive assistant. All contact was to be routed through a single emergency satellite phone. He offered no location, only a precise time for his return. Crucially, Julian made a logistical choice that defied his very nature. He dismissed his personal security detail and called his driver, instructing him to take a roundabout route, dropping him at a nondescript suburban bus depot miles outside the city limits. He explicitly bypassed all the airports and train stations where he might be recognized. Julian's rationale was driven by profound self-judgment regarding his years of absence. He felt intensely unworthy of luxury. To arrive at his childhood home in a tinted window chauffeured limousine after 15 years of phone calls and missed Christmases felt like an insult to his parents and a public display of the very ambition that had corrupted him. He reasoned that the arduous, inconvenient journey, the Pine Creek Express Route 93, was the only fitting vessel for his return, a form of self-imposed hardship that might cleanse the accumulated arrogance of Boston. He arrived at the depot first. It was a windswept, forgotten little junction, smelling faintly of diesel and damp concrete. Julian wore simple dark trousers, a durable wool coat he had not touched in years, and a thick utilitarian scarf. Stripped of the suit, he looked less like a titan of industry and more like a rugged middle-aged academic weary from travel. He stood separate from the small handful of bundled passengers waiting patiently, his mind already adjusting to the decelerated rhythm of rural life. A few minutes later, the depot door hissed open, and the second traveler appeared. It was Clara Vesper. She was unrecognizable from the polished consultant who argued linguistics in the boardroom. She wore a thick, simple cable-knit sweater, worn jeans tucked into sturdy winter boots, and carried a backpack rather than a briefcase. Her face, devoid of makeup, looked younger and profoundly tired, yet somehow softer. Both froze. The initial shock was palpable, a brief silent collision between their two carefully constructed separate realities. Julian saw the former waitress dressed simply. Clara saw the former CEO devoid of his corporate armor, waiting awkwardly by a rusted luggage scale. Julian was the first to recover his expression, shifting rapidly from surprise to annoyance, as if finding her here ruined his attempt at anonymity. "Miss Vesper." He stated the name sounding foreign in this humble setting. He did not ask what she was doing. He simply questioned the reality of her presence. Clara allowed a small, wry smile. "Mr. Vance." She returned, dropping her backpack with a soft thud onto the tiled floor. "I confess I anticipated many things in this life, but sharing the pre-holiday suburban commuter route with the CEO of Ether Dynamics was not among them." Their shared journey back to the world they had both left behind was about to begin. The shock of the encounter at the humble suburban depot had a bizarre effect on both Julian Vance and Clara Vesper. It pushed their professional protocol into overdrive. Instead of collapsing into a natural, informal recognition of absurdity, they stiffened their dialogue, becoming hyper-articulate and entirely lacking in substance. "Mr. Vance," Clara repeated, pulling her cable-knit scarf tighter as the wind picked up speed across the exposed platform. "I am traveling to Pine Creek, Maine. Are you suggesting that Ether Dynamics is considering a satellite office in a town with a population of 750? Julian, who still carried the rigid posture of a man accustomed to demanding silence in large rooms, managed a forced, brittle smile. "A humorous inquiry, Miss Vesper. No. While your assessment of the economic viability is as always accurate, this journey is purely for observational purposes, a study in the logistical efficiency of regional transit." Of course," Clara replied, her eyes glinting with amusement. "Observational research into the logistics of Route 93. I should have guessed. I assumed you were merely indulging in some spontaneous personal travel." "Spontaneous travel is generally inefficient," Julian countered, recovering his composure. "However, one must occasionally recalibrate parameters." This absurd professional fencing continued until the bus, the Pine Creek Express, rumbled into the depot. It was an aging coach, stained with the gray grime of countless winter roads, its destination painted on the side in faded block lettering. They boarded quickly. The interior was dimly lit and smelled of old diesel damp wool and stale coffee. The seats were covered in cracked utilitarian vinyl, the absolute antithesis of Julian Vance's usual ergonomic leather interior. Julian instinctively took a seat near the middle of the bus, placing his small duffel bag on the empty seat beside him. Clara, finding the coach almost full, was forced to take the seat directly across the narrow aisle from him. As the bus pulled away, merging onto the busy interstate and leaving the gleaming towers of Boston behind in the year 2025, the visual juxtaposition was stark. Julian's high-quality wool coat, though simple, contrasted painfully with the worn fabrics and practical garments of the other passengers. He looked like an extraterrestrial trying to pass unnoticed in a rural landscape. The initial silence between them was thick with unsaid questions. Eventually, the steady hiss of the air brakes and the low rumble of the engine forced a detente. "It seems," Clara began, adjusting her position, "that your observation is confirmed. Regional transit is highly inefficient. We have been on the road for 30 minutes and have covered less than half the distance your private driver would manage in 15. Julian sighed, a sound of genuine, unfeigned exhaustion. The inefficiency is acceptable when the objective is distance from the objective itself. The slight opening was the opportunity Clara needed. She dropped the professional armor and spoke with the quiet empathy of one overworked person to another. I understand the pressure, Mr. Vance. I am equally exhausted by the gilded facade. But this extreme measure, the self-imposed inconvenience, it is uncharacteristic. It suggests you are seeking not merely distance, but a complete escape from the identity you've constructed. Julian looked at her, his icy eyes acknowledging the accuracy of her psychological analysis. For once, he didn't correct her. I have not been home to Pine Creek in 15 years, Miss Vesper. He admitted, his voice low enough to be lost in the engine noise. 15 years of prioritizing transactions over traditions, success over family. Do you understand the weight of that equation? I understand the weight of success, Clara replied honestly. It makes the simple things feel impossibly heavy. But you could have sought distance in a private villa flown to Switzerland. Why choose the most arduous route? Why choose the self-imposed penance of a 5-hour bus ride? Julian turned his head fully toward her. His rigid posture softened, revealing the profound weariness of a man who had not slept soundly in months. This was the core of his secret, the vulnerability he had hidden even from his closest associates. He delivered his heartfelt confession, the words sounding quiet and deeply personal against the backdrop of the rumbling engine. I felt I didn't deserve a limousine home after 15 years, Miss Vesper. To arrive in such luxury would be an insult to the life my parents built and an insult to myself. This bus is a form of necessary humility. The confession hung in the cold air between them. Clara was momentarily stunned. The arrogance, the cold intellectual armor was gone, replaced by the profound self-judgment of a penitent son. His brutal honesty shattered the last remnants of their strictly professional dynamic. Julian Vance was no longer her boss. He was simply a very tired, very successful man, desperately trying to reconnect with a version of himself he had abandoned long ago. The unexpected intimacy redefined their relationship entirely, setting the stage for the quiet revelations to come. The landscape outside the bus window had begun its slow, deliberate transformation. The sprawling chain stores and fast food signs of the interstate gave way to dense snow-laden forests and the sparse, singular businesses that marked the boundary of true rural Maine. The Pine Creek Express had slowed its pace, the low hum of its engine now competing with the increasing sound of the wind picking up snow. "We are almost there," Clara murmured, peering out at a welcome sign half buried in a drift. She turned back to Julian Vance, whose cold detachment had utterly dissolved into a profound, almost desperate weariness. The formality between them was eroding, replaced by the fragile intimacy forged by the shared confinement and Julian's unexpected honesty. "It is strange," Clara confessed, her eyes soft with nostalgia. "For 6 months I've spent all my effort translating billions of dollars. But the only thing I truly want to translate right now is the feeling of that first cold air when I step off this bus." Julian nodded, pulling his thick coat tighter. "I imagine Pine Creek feels very different to you than it does to me, Miss Vesper. You seem to anticipate refuge. I anticipate accountability." "Perhaps," Clara said gently. "But there is accountability, and then there are memories. Pine Creek is filled with very good memories for me, especially around Christmas." She settled back against the cracked vinyl, beginning to speak in the quiet, reflective tone of someone recounting a treasured personal fable. "I grew up in the modest part of town not far from the center, but there was one house just off the main road that was always magical to me. It wasn't the biggest, but it was unique. It stood apart from all the typical New England capes and salt boxes. It was purely different. Laruscour." Julian listened, his gaze fixed on her, but his mind seemed far away, tracking the description. It was built in the Gothic Revival style, Clara elaborated her academic training, momentarily surfacing. Steep gables, intricate fretwork, and the main windows were tall and pointed-arched like a cathedral. Every Christmas that house was magnificent. It always had the biggest, brightest tree visible from the street. And the people who lived there, she paused, her voice softening further. They were the kindest. Mr. and Mrs. Vance. I called them my Christmas angels. My parents struggled, especially when I was young, but Mrs. Vance, she always invited me over. She would teach me German nursery rhymes and give me fresh, warm gingerbread cookies. They were the reason I fell in love with language, actually. A tremor ran through Julian's body. He lifted a hand, unconsciously tracing the line of his jaw. The name Vance and the specific, unusual architecture of his childhood home were colliding with Clara's intimate memories. They spoke of their son often. Clara continued, unaware of the internal earthquake she was causing. They were so proud, so fiercely proud of their successful boy who was building an empire in the city. They called him Little Julian, but they were always heartbroken that Little Julian never came home for Christmas. They would sit by the fire and sigh, looking at a framed photograph of him. That postcard I keep at work, Mrs. Vance sent it to me years ago. Clara finished her recollection, a warm, nostalgic smile on her face. She looked at Julian, expecting a simple acknowledgement. Instead, she saw a man whose iron composure had finally shattered. Julian Vance was pale, his eyes wide and dark with shock. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a sudden, intense focus. "The house," Julian interrupted, his voice tight, rough, and barely above a whisper. "The house you are describing, Miss Vesper. It had a main window on the ground floor facing east toward the creek. Was there something unique about the stone?" Clara frowned slightly, trying to pull the precise image from decades ago. Yes, the frame itself was made of dark, heavy granite, and there was a detail, a specific complex carving set into the lower stone bow of the window frame. Julian leaned forward, his entire body rigid with anticipation. This was the final, undeniable proof. He asked, his voice shaking slightly with the force of the memory. "Was that carving a shield, Miss Vesper? A specific heraldic symbol of an acorn surrounded by oak leaves, a small family crest that my father carved himself in, the year 1985. Clara Vesper felt the blood drain from her face. That detail, the intricate, almost hidden crest, was something she had only seen when peering closely through the frosted glass, a detail no casual passerby would ever know. It was the physical proof needed to bridge the unbelievable gap between the man across the aisle and the memories of the kind gingerbread baking woman. "Yes," Clara breathed, the sound barely audible over the roaring engine. "The crest. I remember it. It was beautiful." Julian Vance slumped back into the worn vinyl seat, the weight of the undeniable truth crashing down upon him. He closed his eyes momentarily, the arrogance of the CEO erased entirely. The world had just shrunk to the size of a single Gothic revival house in a small Maine town, and he'd been blind to his own past. He was the absent son, and the woman who had called him intellectually incompetent was the child his mother had comforted in his long absence. He opened his eyes and looked at Clara, not as a consultant, but as a living, breathing part of the childhood he had thrown away. Clara Vesper felt the cold, hard vinyl of the bus seat beneath her fingers, the only anchor in a reality that had just become utterly surreal. She stared at Julian Vance, who was no longer the imposing CEO, but a man reduced to the silence of absolute shock. The pieces scattered for 2 decades had locked into place with a terrifying precision. The cold, arrogant boss who had mocked her intelligence was the legendary absent Little Julian, whose kind parents had formed the very basis of her love for language. The profound guilt written on Julian's face was unbearable. He was mourning the loss of a past he didn't even realize he had cherished until she, the former waitress, had forced him to look at it. He took a ragged breath, the sound barely audible over the slowing engine of the bus. He turned his head and met Clara's gaze, the arrogance finally stripped away, revealing a raw, unfamiliar vulnerability. Tears welled in his icy eyes, not of sorrow, but of profound regret. He spoke softly the words, broken between the two languages that defined their strange, beautiful relationship. Ich habe alles vergessen, he whispered in German, his voice thick. I had forgotten everything. The wood, the sound of the carving tools, the smell of my father's pine pitch in the year 1985. You remember every detail. He reached out a hand across the narrow aisle, not in a gesture of command, but of desperate supplication. Clara, he used her first name the first time he had ever done so. The boy you knew, the one whose memories kept my mother warm every Christmas, is me. I am little Julian. Clara felt a wave of empathy rush over her, washing away the professional distance she had maintained for months. She understood the weight of his confession. He was admitting that the pride and ambition he had used to escape Pine Creek were built on the crushing foundation of neglecting the people who loved him most. The Pine Creek Express announced its arrival with a pneumatic hiss and a low grind of the brakes. They had reached the village square. The transition from the bus's cramped interior to the vast, cold stillness of the Maine night was abrupt. Julian and Clara stepped out onto the snow-covered asphalt. The only sound was the wind carrying the distant muffled pealing of church bells and the crunch of their boots on the fresh powder. They retrieved their bags. Julian stood immobilized, gazing down the short winding road that led toward his childhood home. The sight of the familiar snow-covered landscape seemed to paralyze him. Clara moved toward him. "The humility, Mr. Vance," she said gently, using his title one last time to remind him of the distance they had traveled. "It has been accepted. The penance is over." Julian turned to her, his expression a mixture of shame and relief. "I wasted 15 years, Clara. I built an empire to impress them, and I forgot the only thing that mattered was a 5-hour bus ride." "Arrogance is often just loneliness in disguise," Clara responded, echoing the lesson she had learned long ago. "And you, Julian Vance, built a fortress of success to hide the little boy who needed his mother's gingerbread." She looped her arm through his, a gesture of pure necessary support. "Let us go. I remember the way." They walked together down the quiet, snow-dusted lane. Julian, usually striding forward with the confidence of command, kept his pace measured, almost hesitant. Then the house came into view. It stood exactly as Clara remembered it, the distinctive Gothic Revival architecture soaring against the dark sky, its steep gables draped in snow like thick lace. But tonight, it wasn't just architecturally unique. The windows glowed with a warm, almost luminous yellow light, radiating a palpable sense of comfort and safety. This sight was the final devastating piece of the puzzle for Julian. He had tried to outrun the simple, profound beauty of his home for global dominance. Clara gently pulled him toward the front porch. "Go on," she whispered. "They're waiting." Julian paused, his hand shaking as he reached for the carved wooden door. He took a deep breath, shedding the last vestiges of the CEO. When Mr. Vance Sr. opened the door, a kind man whose face was wrinkled by laughter, not worry, he saw his son. Not the powerful figure on the cover of magazines, but his little Julian in a simple wool coat. The reunion was silent, a hug that lasted for an eternity, filled with the weight of 15 years of missed Christmases. Mrs. Vance appeared behind her husband, her eyes instantly finding Clara. "Clara Vesper. You came home, my dear." She enveloped Clara in a fierce, warm embrace, utterly oblivious to the drama that had unfolded miles away. Clara Vesper, no longer the corporate consultant, watched the emotional reunion of father, mother, and son. She had forced the arrogant boss to confront his past, not with a contract or a merger, but with a family crest and a memory of gingerbread. She had arrived in Pine Creek with nothing but professional exhaustion. She left the snowy porch that night with a sense of connection and the quiet realization that the greatest value she possessed was not in translating contracts, but in translating the human heart. Julian Vance had finally come home, and Clara, his old neighbor, was there to witness the redemption of little Julian this Christmas. The truest worth we possess is not found in the towers of glass and steel, but in the simple, fragile connections we choose to honor. Julian Vance learned that the ultimate form of success is the memory of kindness carried by a neighbor, and that forgiveness begins with acknowledging the past. If this story of finding home and humility resonated with your heart this Christmas season, let us know. Tell us your story of reunion in the comments below, share this message of hope with a friend, and join our family by subscribing. Click the newest video on your screen now to continue the journey.